Easy money. Sloane Brooks said it the way people say good morning, automatic, unthinking, already certain of the answer. She was standing at the center of the mat under a wash of gymnasium lights, 34 years old, a third-degree black belt, and the founder of Apex Combat Academy. She had just dropped her fourth volunteer of the evening in under 40 seconds each, and the crowd inside the Cedar Falls Community Center was hers completely. She scanned the bleachers the way a hawk scans an open field, not searching exactly. Selecting. Her eyes stopped on a man in the back row. Work boots, a faded Carhartt jacket, a young boy sitting close beside him, watching the mat with wide, serious eyes. Sloane smiled. She raised the microphone and pointed directly at him. Nobody in that gymnasium, not the laughing crowd, not Sloane herself, had any idea she had just made the worst mistake of her career. The first Friday of every month belonged to Owen. That was the rule Reed Walker had set for himself 2 years ago, not long after the divorce was finalized, and the house in Durango started feeling less like a home and more like a storage unit for things he hadn't figured out how to get rid of yet. Every first Friday, no matter how many yards needed mowing or how far behind the crew had fallen, Reed would wash the dirt off his hands, change out of his work clothes, and drive his son to the Cedar Falls Community Center for the junior martial arts class. It wasn't about the martial arts. Owen knew that. Reed knew that too. It was about the drive over the 20 minutes of bad radio, and Owen talking about whatever had happened at school that week, the way the boy's voice would climb half an octave when something had genuinely excited him. Those 20 minutes were worth more to Reed than anything else the week had to offer. Owen was 9 years old, and serious in the way that quiet children often are, not shy exactly, but watchful. He had his mother's eyes, and Reed's tendency to go still when something caught his attention. He'd been taking the junior class for 8 months, and had recently earned his second stripe, a fact he'd mentioned only once, but had thought about every day since. Tonight was different from a typical First Friday. Reed had noticed the banner outside the community center when he pulled into the parking lot. Apex Combat Academy presents an evening of champions, and thought nothing of it beyond mild curiosity. Owen had bounced in his seat and said that his instructor, Mr. Briggs, told the class there would be a special demonstration tonight. A real black belt. Multiple championships. Reed had nodded and said that sounded great. Inside, the main gymnasium had been rearranged. The folding chairs usually stacked against the far wall were now set up in loose rows, facing a competition mat that someone had laid over the hardwood floor. The bleachers on both sides were filling steadily. Parents, kids, a few older men Reed didn't recognize. The whole room hummed with the particular energy of a crowd that expected to be impressed. Reed found 2 seats in the back row close to the exit. Old habit. The lights dropped and Sloane Brooks walked out. She carried herself the way people do when they've spent years being the most capable person in any given room and have simply stopped pretending otherwise. She was lean and precise in her movements, her dark hair pulled back tight, wearing the black uniform of her academy, with the logo stitched in silver across the chest. The crowd responded immediately, applause from the parents, a few genuine cheers from the kids up front, who recognized her from videos they'd watched online. She took the microphone from the event coordinator and smiled, and it was a real smile, the kind that came from genuine comfort in front of an audience. "Thank you all for coming out tonight," she said. "I'm going to keep the talking short because what I do is better shown than explained." More applause. What followed was, Reed had to admit, genuinely impressive. Sloane worked through a series of demonstrations with volunteers pulled from the audience, technical controlled, and fast. A teenager who'd been grinning confidently found himself flat on the mat in less than 30 seconds. A heavy-set man in his 40s who tried to grab her wrist ended up bent forward, with his arm locked at an angle that left him no option but to tap out immediately. She moved between styles fluidly, explaining each technique briefly before executing it with a precision that made the crowd gasp each time. She was good. Reed recognized that without any particular emotion attached to it, the way a carpenter recognizes good joinery simply as a fact. Between demonstrations, she talked about Apex Combat Academy. Enrollment was open. Beginner classes available for all ages. First month half price for Cedar Falls residents. She wove the sales pitch into the performance so naturally that most of the audience probably didn't register it as a pitch at all. What the audience also didn't register, because there was no reason they would, was the particular tension underneath the performance. Sloane had driven 3 hours to Cedar Falls for this event. She had reserved the gymnasium, printed the banners, coordinated the staff, and rehearsed the talking points, all for a community center crowd in a town she'd never worked before. 6 months ago, she wouldn't have needed to. 6 months ago, Apex Combat Academy had 3 locations, a waiting list for the flagship classes, and a reputation in the regional competition circuit that generated its own momentum. Then enrollment started softening. Then the Riverside location closed. Then the numbers at the remaining 2 academies began sliding in a direction that kept Sloane awake past midnight, more evenings than she liked to count. She needed this room. Not the Cedar Falls Community Center specifically. She needed what this room represented. New students, new families. A story she could take back and point to as proof that the brand still moved people. So she performed, and she was good at it. And the crowd was responding the way crowds respond when someone skilled is working hard for them. But somewhere in the second half of the demonstration, her attention split. Part of her was still on the mat, executing engaging. Another part was running a quiet assessment of the audience, not for appreciation, but for opportunity. Then she started scanning the crowd. Reed had seen that particular shift in body language before, in contexts he didn't think about anymore if he could help it. The performance was over. Now she was looking for something specific. Her eyes moved across the bleachers with a practiced kind of casualness that wasn't casual at all. They landed on him. He felt it before he fully processed it, that particular weight of being selected. Sloane Brooks raised the microphone and smiled in his direction. "How about you?" she said. "In the back, the gentleman in the work jacket." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. Heads turned. Owen looked up at his father with an expression that was equal parts curiosity and concern. Reed kept his voice even and his expression neutral. "I'm all right. Thank you." "Come on," Sloane said, and her tone was warm, performative, designed to make refusal seem like cowardice. "It's just for fun. I promise I'll be gentle." More laughter. Someone near the front actually clapped. "I'm good," Reed said. He wasn't angry. He understood exactly what she was doing. She wanted contrast, a visual. The big guy in the worn jacket who looked like he'd never thrown a punch that wasn't at a fence post. It would play well. The crowd would love it. It was smart marketing, honestly. He just wasn't going to do it. Sloane let a beat pass, then tilted her head slightly. "You know it's okay to be nervous. Nobody's going to judge you." The laughter this time was louder, and Reed heard the specific quality of it, the kind of laugh that required a target. A few people in the middle rows turned around to look at him, directly grinning. Owen had gone very still beside him. Then Sloane did the one thing that changed the entire calculation. She looked at Owen, at his son, his 9-year-old boy with his 2 stripes and his serious eyes, and she said into the microphone, "What's your name, sweetheart?" Owen answered before he thought to look at his father. "Owen. Owen." Sloane repeated the name warmly for the whole room. "Owen, don't you want to see your dad be brave tonight?" The crowd cooed. Someone said, "Oh." It was perfectly executed, the kind of move that left the target no dignified exit, because now the refusal wasn't just about him. It was about what his son would remember. Reed looked at Owen. The boy wasn't embarrassed. He wasn't pressuring his father with his eyes the way some kids might. He was simply watching, waiting in that still and patient way he had, as if he already trusted whatever his father decided. That was the thing that moved Reed. Not the crowd. Not Sloane Brooks and her microphone. Owen's quiet, unconditional trust, and the understanding that a boy carries what he sees his father do in moments like this for a very long time. Reed reached over and set his hand briefly on Owen's shoulder. "Stay here," he said quietly. "I'll be right back." He stood up. The crowd erupted. Sloane Brooks watched him walk toward the mat and allowed herself a small, private thought. This will be over in 30 seconds. She had no way of knowing she was right about almost nothing else that night. Reed stepped onto the mat in his work boots, which was already wrong by every standard of the space he was entering. No wraps, no mouthguard. Still wearing the faded Carhartt jacket he'd had on since 6 that morning. The crowd found this delightful. A few people near the front were already pulling out their phones. Sloane handed the microphone back to the event coordinator and rolled her shoulders once settling into herself. Up close, she was faster looking than she'd appeared from the bleachers, the kind of athlete whose real speed only becomes apparent when you're standing within range of it. She gave Reed a professional nod, the sort of courtesy you extend to someone before doing something to them. "Whenever you're ready," she said. Reed said nothing. He stood with his hands loose at his sides and watched her. Sloane came in clean and direct, a jab-cross combination that she'd thrown 10,000 times, maybe more. It was textbook sharp, well-timed, designed to establish range and test reaction. Against an untrained opponent, even the first jab usually produced something useful: a flinch, a stumble backward, a guard thrown up too wide. Information she could work with. Reed's head moved 3 inches to the left. Just that. The cross slipped past his ear, and he was already somewhere slightly different from where he'd been, not retreating, just no longer exactly where she'd aimed. Sloane reset and went to the body, a left hook angled toward his ribs, followed by a low kick targeting his lead leg. The hook met a forearm that had arrived without any apparent urgency. The kick landed, but the leg it hit had already shifted its weight, robbing the strike of most of what it was supposed to accomplish. Reed absorbed the remainder without any visible reaction. He still hadn't thrown anything back. The crowd laughed, reading it as luck or stubbornness or some combination of both. Someone shouted, "Get him, lady," and got a round of laughter in return. Sloane heard it and felt the familiar comfort of a crowd behind her. She pushed the pace, working through her combinations with increasing speed. Jab, jab, cross-level change, sweep attempt at his base. The sweep found nothing. Reed had shifted his weight a half second before she committed to it, and the leg she tried to take wasn't bearing what she expected. She recovered cleanly, a professional's adjustment, but the attempt hadn't worked, and she felt that, in a way, she didn't immediately examine. She went back to striking faster now. Jab to draw the guard up, low kick to punish the base, then a sharp elbow feint toward the clinch. Reed covered the jab, absorbed the kick, the same way he had the first one, and when she came in for the clinch, he simply wasn't in the position the feint had been designed for. He was 6 inches to the outside, and her elbow passed through empty space. No counter. He just stood there, watching her with the same expression he'd had since he stepped on the mat. Near the back of the gymnasium, in the last row of the bleachers opposite where Owen was sitting, a man in his mid-60s had stopped talking to the person beside him. He was lean in the way of someone who'd been athletic for a long time and had simply stayed that way out of habit. He watched Reed move, or rather watched the specific quality of the way Reed wasn't moving, and his expression shifted into something more focused and considerably more serious. Whatever he was seeing, it was not what the rest of the crowd was seeing. He leaned forward, slightly, elbows on his knees, and did not look away again for the remainder of the fight. Back on the mat, Sloane was recalibrating. She was not a vain fighter. Years of competition had burned vanity out of her, replaced it with the more useful quality of honest self-assessment. She knew when something was off. This was off. The man in front of her was not doing what untrained men did. He wasn't swinging wildly, wasn't freezing, wasn't telegraphing the basic panic responses that made demonstration work predictable. He was slipping her jabs with head movement that had no business being that economical. He was absorbing her kicks with weight distribution that suggested he'd spent real time learning how not to be where power wanted him to be. And he wasn't hitting her back, which somehow was the most unsettling part. She brought out the combination that had closed out her last regional championship, a double jab to push the guard high drop step to the outside spinning heel kick, targeting the side of the head. It was her signature. She'd landed it on fighters who'd specifically trained to stop it. Against someone in work boots with no apparent guard structure, it should have been academic. Reed watched the double jab come in and covered both, moving his head off the center line as she dropped. Stepped. When the heel came around, he was already inside the arc of it, not because he'd seen the kick coming exactly, but because the drop step had given him a geometry he recognized, and he'd moved into the only position that made the kick irrelevant. The heel sailed past his shoulder at a distance that made the crowd go quiet for the first time, not because they understood what had happened, but because on some instinctive level they felt it. Sloane felt it more precisely. She landed reset, and for one fraction of a second, she looked at him with something that wasn't part of the performance. The laughter in the gymnasium had stopped. The phones that had been out for the first 2 minutes were lowering one by one as the people holding them began to sense that whatever this was, it had changed into something they hadn't bought tickets for. Sloane made her decision quietly and quickly, the way she made most decisions. The demonstration was over. That version of the evening, the one where she was the expert and he was the prop, had already ended. What was happening now was a fight, or the closest thing to one that a community center gymnasium was going to see on a Friday night. She stopped performing and started competing. The shift was immediate and visible. Her stance tightened. The controlled showmanship left her movement and was replaced by something more direct and considerably more dangerous. She abandoned the combinations designed to look impressive and went back to fundamentals, pressure angles, attrition. She was faster than Reed, more technically sophisticated, and she knew her conditioning was superior. If she turned this into a grinding contest of will and output, she believed she could expose whatever wall he was operating behind. She went at him in bursts, 3 and 4 strikes at a time, changing levels, changing rhythm, refusing to let him find a predictable pattern. She landed more now, cleaner shots, better positioned. A right hand grazed his cheekbone. A body kick connected solidly enough that she heard the impact. A knee in the clinch she managed to force for 2 seconds, landed before he disengaged. Reed took all of it and kept moving. What he was doing was costing him more than it appeared to be costing him. Each strike he absorbed deliberately choosing to take the hit rather than respond in the way his body kept insisting it knew how to respond. There was a thing that happened in training and later in other places where the body and the mind reached a kind of agreement. This is what we do when the threat is real. Reed had spent years building that agreement until it was faster than thought. Now he was spending every second on the mat overriding it, staying on the surface of the fight, while something older and more practiced pushed steadily from underneath. He was managing it. He told himself he was managing it. Then Sloane landed the right hand clean. Not the graze from before this one had her full weight behind it, caught him at the temple with the kind of snap that made the crowd inhale sharply. Reed's vision went white at the edges for a half-second, that specific white that isn't quite pain yet and isn't quite not pain either. And in that half-second, something moved in him that he'd kept very still for 4 years. Sound dropped out and came back different. The gymnasium lights seemed to flatten. The smell of floor wax and recycled air became something else entirely. Something damp and cold and open that had no business existing inside a building in Colorado. His hands, which had been loose and deliberate, tightened once at his sides in a way that had nothing to do with anything happening in Cedar Falls. He was somewhere else for a moment. Not fully, he never went fully. The training wouldn't allow it, but enough. Enough to feel the weight of a different kind of readiness settle across his shoulders, the particular clarity that comes when the body decides the situation is no longer theoretical. The agreement he'd made with himself about restraint felt very far away and slightly abstract. He blinked it back. One breath, slow and deliberate, the kind he'd learned to use as an anchor. The gymnasium reassembled itself around him, the crowd, the Matt Owen, somewhere in the back row. Sloane in front of him reading his reaction with the focused attention of a fighter who senses she's found something. She pressed forward immediately, sensing the opening, going to the body hard with both hands. Reed knew with a clarity that was almost administrative that he couldn't keep doing what he'd been doing. Not because he was hurt, not because she was winning, but because the next time she hit him like that, the agreement he'd made with himself about how this evening was going to go might not hold. And if it didn't hold, someone was going to get hurt in a way that had no business happening in a community center, gymnasium in front of 200 people and a 9-year-old boy. He had to end it. Cleanly. Without damage. Now. Sloane loaded up for what she decided would be her finishing sequence, the same pressure combination she'd been building toward for the last 90 seconds, designed to back him to the edge of the mat and take away his ability to keep moving laterally. She came in hard and committed her full weight, driving forward. Reed waited until she was fully committed to the first strike of the sequence, the moment between decision and delivery, when a fighter's weight is irrevocably forward, and he stepped not back, but into her inside the arc of the punch, so close that the strike had nowhere to land. What he did next took approximately 4 seconds and required almost no visible effort. His right hand found her lead wrist. His left arm came across and under hers at the elbow. One small pivot of his hips, a redirection of the momentum she'd already committed, and Sloane Brooks found herself rotated 90 degrees with her right arm controlled at 2 points and her shoulder joint at an angle that allowed for exactly 0 resistance without causing herself significant pain. He held her there, still, not forcing, just present. Sloane had been in enough competition to perform an immediate structural analysis of her situation. She could not move forward, she could not move backward without walking into more pressure on her shoulder. She could not drop without the grip on her wrist following her down. The position was complete. It had been complete, she realized, from the moment he'd stepped inside her punch, which meant he'd seen it coming from at least a second before she threw it. He could have done this much earlier. That thought arrived with a coldness that had nothing to do with the temperature in the gymnasium. He had let her work. He had stood there and absorbed her best combinations and her championship technique and her escalating pressure, and at no point had he been in any real danger, because at no point had he been trying to do anything except not hurt her. The entire fight from Sloane's perspective had been a controlled exercise. From Reed's perspective, she now understood it had simply been patience. The gymnasium was absolutely silent. Reed held the position for 1 second, too long enough for the stillness to be complete and unambiguous. Then, with the same absence of drama with which he'd stepped onto the mat, he opened his hands and stepped back. He didn't say anything. He didn't look at the crowd. He turned slightly toward the edge of the mat, his hands dropping back to his sides, already somewhere else in his head. Sloane stood upright in the silence of 200 people who had no framework for what they had just watched. The silence held for 3 full seconds, which is a long time when 200 people are all holding the same breath. Then Owen Walker came down from the bleachers at a 9-year-old's version of dignified speed, which is to say, he was running, and crossed the mat and wrapped both arms around his father's midsection with the particular force of a child who has been sitting very still for a very long time, while being very worried. Reed put one hand on the back of his son's head and stood there, and that was the entirety of his victory celebration. The crowd found its voice in pieces. A few people started clapping, then more, and within several seconds the gymnasium had produced the kind of applause that carries genuine bewilderment inside it, the sound of people responding to something they hadn't expected to feel. Reed didn't acknowledge it. He was looking down at Owen, checking the boy's face the way fathers do when they've done something in front of their children and need to know how it landed. Owen looked up at him with an expression that was not awe exactly, and not pride exactly, but something quieter than either the look of a child whose understanding of his father has just expanded in a direction he doesn't yet have words for. Reed's temple was beginning to register the clean right hand Sloane had landed in the second half of the fight, a dull, insistent pulse that he noted and set aside the way he'd learned to set things aside. He kept his face still. Owen didn't need to see that. Sloane was still standing near the center of the mat. She hadn't moved since Reed stepped back and released her. She was working through something privately, visibly, in the way that people do when an experience has overwritten something they believed about themselves, and they're trying to locate exactly which belief it was. Her staff member had appeared at the edge of the mat with a water bottle, and she waved him off without looking at him. The man from the back of the bleachers made his way down through the emptying rows, unhurried, moving with the ease of someone who'd spent decades being comfortable in spaces that made other people tense. He was the same man who had gone still and watchful midway through the fight, the one who had seen something in Reed's movement that the rest of the crowd had missed entirely. He was wearing a plain gray Henley and had the kind of forearms that suggested a long history of physical work. He stepped to the edge of the mat and looked at Reed with an expression that had already answered its own question before he asked it. "Where did you serve?" the man said. Reed looked up from Owen. He took in the man's bearing the particular way he'd phrased the question, not "were you in the military" or "are you ex-military," but the direct, assumption-laden shorthand of someone who already knew the answer and was only asking for the specifics. "Naval Special Warfare," Reed said. "Separated 4 years ago." The man nodded once slowly, the way people nod when information confirms something they'd already organized their understanding around. He put out his hand. "Frank Delaney, 22 years Army Rangers, retired." Reed shook it. Around them, the exchange was moving outward through the crowd, the way information moves when people are standing close together and very quiet. Naval Special Warfare. The words passed from one person to the next, acquiring weight and context as they traveled, and what arrived at the far edges of the room was the full understanding of what those words meant. The man they had laughed at, the man in the worn jacket they'd expected to be embarrassed in front of his son, was a Navy SEAL. The laughter that had filled the gymnasium 40 minutes ago now had nowhere comfortable to land. Sloane heard it too. She picked up the microphone from the event coordinator's table, not because she'd planned what she was going to say, but because she understood that this moment required her to speak, and that what she said in the next 60 seconds would define considerably more than just the remainder of the evening. She looked out at the crowd, then back at Reed, who was now crouched down at Owen's level, saying something quietly to the boy. She waited until he straightened before she spoke. "I owe this room an apology," Sloane said into the microphone. "And I owe this man, one in particular." The gymnasium went attentive in the way crowds do when they sense someone is about to say something true. I looked at him and I thought I knew exactly what I was looking at. Sloane kept her voice steady, though the steadiness cost her something. "I've spent 15 years in this sport. I've won competitions. I've built a business. I've taught hundreds of students. And tonight I walked into this gymnasium confident that I could read any room and any person in it." She let that statement exist for a moment without elaboration. "I was wrong, not about his background. I didn't know his background. I was wrong about something more basic than that. I decided what he was before I had any right to decide anything." She looked at Reed directly. "I used your son to pressure you onto that mat. That wasn't showmanship. That was poor character. I'm sorry for it." Reed listened to this with his hand resting on Owen's shoulder. He gave a single nod. not a performance, not magnanimity for the crowd's benefit. Just an acknowledgement that the apology had been received. Frank Delaney was still standing at the edge of the mat. He said to no one in particular, and everyone in general, "Son of a gun," and shook his head with something that looked like satisfaction. Sloane set the microphone down and looked at her staff, then at the students from her academy, who had come tonight expecting to see their instructor perform, and had instead witnessed something that would likely inform how they thought about martial arts and about assumptions for a considerable time. She could see it on their faces, the recalibration happening in real time, and she found that she was glad for it, even though she was the reason it was necessary. She walked to the edge of the mat and stopped in front of Reed. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Her voice lower now without the microphone between them. "Go ahead," Reed said. "At the end, the way you controlled that position." Sloane chose her words with care. "You could have done that 10 minutes earlier." It wasn't quite a question. Reed treated it like one anyway. "Yeah," he said. Sloane absorbed this with the discipline of someone who had made a practice of accepting difficult truths. "Why didn't you?" Reed glanced down at Owen briefly, then back at her. "Because you didn't need to get hurt. You needed to stop." Sloane looked at him for a long moment. Then she stepped back and gave him the kind of bow that martial artists give each other when the bout is finished. And the respect is genuine, not a performance, just the clean, simple gesture of one practitioner acknowledging another. Reed returned it with a nod that carried the same weight. Owen watched this exchange with his serious eyes and filed it somewhere important. They left the way they'd arrived, Reed with his hand briefly on Owen's back, guiding him through the clusters of people who parted naturally, and watched them go with expressions that had replaced the evening's earlier laughter with something more complicated and considerably more lasting. A few people nodded at Reed as he passed. One man near the exit, a father Reed had seen at previous junior classes, said, "Good on you," in a low voice, and Reed said, "Appreciate it," without slowing down. Frank Delaney watched them go from where he stood, and the expression on his face was the particular kind of pride that men of that background reserve for moments they recognize from the inside. The parking lot was cold and clear. The Colorado night doing what Colorado nights do in late autumn, arriving fast and staying serious. Owen pulled his jacket tighter and matched his father's pace across the lot toward the truck. They drove the first few minutes in the comfortable quiet that had always been native to their time together. The radio played something neither of them was listening to. The town passed by outside the windows, ordinary and familiar, and lit the way small towns are lit at night, sparsely, warmly, like it had decided long ago that it didn't need to impress anyone. Owen spoke first. "Dad, you knew she was going to do that combo before she threw it. It wasn't quite a question." Reed kept his eyes on the road. "The footwork told me," he said. Owen thought about this with the focused attention he brought to things that genuinely interested him. "Mr. Briggs says reading footwork takes years." "It does." Another stretch of quiet. Then Owen said, "Why didn't you just win right away?" Reed was quiet for a moment, not because he didn't have an answer, but because he wanted to give the boy the right one. "Winning wasn't the point," he said. "She wasn't trying to hurt me. She was trying to make herself look good, and she got in over her head. The point was to stop it without anybody walking out of there damaged." Owen turned this over. Outside a gas station passed, then a stretch of dark field. "She said sorry," Owen said. "She did." "Was it a real sorry?" Reed considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Yeah," he said. "I think it was." Owen nodded, apparently satisfied. He looked out the window for a while, and Reed let him look, knowing the boy was working through something at his own pace. That was one of Owen's better qualities. He didn't rush his own thinking just because someone was watching him do it. "Dad," Owen said finally. "Yeah, I wasn't scared when she said that stuff." Owen's voice was careful, precise, the way it got when he was being exactly honest. I wasn't embarrassed either. I knew you'd figure out what to do. Reed kept his eyes on the road. Something moved in his chest that he didn't try to name. I know you did, he said. He reached over and put his hand on the back of his son's neck for a moment, the way he had when Owen was small, and the gesture had meant, "You're safe, I've got you." Then he put his hand back on the wheel. They were quiet for another mile. The road curved west, and the mountains appeared in the distance, darker than the sky behind them, solid and indifferent in the way that mountains are. Owen said, "Did it hurt when she hit you?" Reed thought about the honest answer. "Some of it did. How come you didn't show it?" "Because showing it would have changed what was happening. And I needed to stay in control of what was happening." Owen looked at the mountains. "Is that something you learned, or something you just knew how to do?" It was a better question than most adults would think to ask. Reed let it sit for a moment before he answered. "Learned," he said. "The hard way mostly." Owen accepted this without pressing further, which was another thing Reed had come to appreciate about him. He knew instinctively when a subject had reached its natural boundary, and when pushing past, it would only produce words rather than truth. They drove in silence for a while, and the silence was the easy kind, the kind that belongs to people who have nothing to prove to each other. "Dad." "Yeah." "I'm glad you went up there." Reed glanced over at his son, the serious profile, the jacket still zipped to his chin, the second stripe on his belt visible at his waist. He looked back at the road. "Me too," he said. The truck moved through the dark and the quiet of the Colorado night heading home. Back at the Cedar Falls Community Center after the crowd had filed out, and the folding chairs had been stacked, and the competition mat rolled to the side, Sloane Brooks sat alone on the gymnasium floor. Her staff had offered to wait. She'd told them to go ahead. She needed a few minutes in the empty room, and they knew her well enough to understand that this was not a request that invited company. She sat with her back against the bleachers and looked at the mat. The academy's enrollment numbers were real, the financial pressure was real, and none of that had changed in the last 2 hours. She still had the same problems she'd walked in with tonight. The drive back would be 3 hours of dark highway, and by the time she pulled into her parking garage, it would be past midnight. And Monday morning, the spreadsheets would still say what they'd said on Friday morning. None of that had moved, but something else had. She'd built Apex Combat Academy on a particular idea of what she was, what she represented. She was the woman who walked into any room and already knew more than anyone else in it. She was the instructor who could read a body's mechanics in 3 seconds and identify every weakness in a fighter's game before the first round ended. She had cultivated that identity carefully over 15 years because it was useful, because it set her apart, because in a business built on credibility, it functioned as currency, and it had made her stupid in ways she hadn't noticed until tonight. She'd looked at Reed Walker, the work jacket, the boots, the quiet manner, and she'd assigned him a role before he'd done a single thing to earn it. She'd looked at Owen and seen not a child, but an instrument. She'd looked at a gymnasium full of people and seen not an audience, but a transaction. And somewhere in that process of converting human beings into functions, she had lost track of the most basic lesson that 15 years of martial arts was supposed to have taught her, that you never know what someone is carrying until they show you, and you only get to see it if you have enough respect to look. Reed Walker had showed her. He'd showed her quietly without cruelty, with a restraint that she understood, now had cost him something real, and he'd done it in front of his son, which meant the restraint had cost him more than it would have cost most people, because he could have ended it with force and chosen not to, for reasons that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with the boy in the back row. That was the thing she kept returning to. Not the technique, not the controlled submission hold, not even the revelation of his background. It was the choice. He'd had power enough to do real damage, had felt whatever it was he'd felt. When she caught him clean at the temple, she'd seen it cross his face for a half-second. Something old and serious that didn't belong in this gymnasium, and he'd pulled it back. He'd chosen the harder thing because the harder thing was the right one. She'd spent 15 years teaching students that martial arts was fundamentally about self-control, that the physical technique was only ever an expression of something deeper. She'd said those words in classes and promotional materials, in interviews, for regional sports publications. She had believed them, or thought she had. Tonight she'd watched someone actually live them, under conditions that weren't comfortable or theoretical, and she'd realized she wasn't entirely sure she would have done the same. That was worth sitting with. Her phone had notifications, people from the evening, her staff checking in 2 numbers she didn't recognize that were probably people who'd been in the audience. She put it face down on the floor beside her. She thought about the students who'd been there tonight. Some of them had been training with her for years. They'd watched their instructor get taken apart systematically by a man in work clothes who hadn't thrown a single aggressive strike, and then they'd watched her stand up in front of a full gymnasium and tell the truth about what had happened. She hoped they'd remember the second part as clearly as the first. She hoped that when they thought about this evening in a year or 5 years, the image that came back wasn't Sloane locked in a submission hold she couldn't escape, though that image would be accurate, but Sloane picking up the microphone afterward and saying the thing that was hardest to say. She had work to do. Real work, the kind that had nothing to do with performance or optics, or finding the right crowd to impress. The Academy's problems weren't going to solve themselves, and some of the solutions she'd been avoiding, because they required admitting things she hadn't wanted to admit. She could see that more clearly now. She could also see that she was going to be a better teacher for what had happened tonight, even though it had been humiliating, even though the video was certainly going to circulate, and she was going to have to develop a relationship with that fact. She could see it because, for the first time in longer than she wanted to acknowledge, she'd been genuinely surprised by another human being. She'd been wrong about something in a way that mattered, and she'd had to update her understanding in real time with 200 people watching. That was good for her. She knew it was good for her, even as she sat on a cold gymnasium floor at 9:30 on a Friday night, feeling the particular exhaustion of having used more of herself than she'd budgeted for. The lights in the gymnasium were on their automatic timer. At some point they clicked off and Sloane sat in the dark for a while longer, not thinking anymore, just sitting in the quiet of the empty room with the smell of the mat and the faint sound of the building's ventilation system. It was not a comfortable silence, but it was an honest one, and she decided that was enough for tonight. She finally got up, picked up her bag and her phone, and walked out into the cold parking lot. Her car was one of 3 remaining. The banner she'd hung outside the community center entrance, Apex Combat Academy, presents an evening of champions, shifted slightly in the night wind. She didn't look at it as she walked past. She had work to do. The strongest person in the room is rarely the one who needs to prove it.